another bundle of 4 Playboy magazines relating to the 90s and 2000s. But again, I'm going to talk about that tomorrow. Controversial topic, but I'm looking forward to it. Right, so I said to you today I'm going to be doing a video talking about something a bit different today. But basically, best way to start with this is what I aim to do. And at the Collectors Launch, my aim is to connect collectors with collectibles, and that's a really good way to start the video for me, because the aim today is to talk about a problem that I'm having, and it's becoming harder to sell certain collectibles on selling platforms. And as a general rule, I think that, like, I've made some notes here, so I'm going to be looking at these, but as a general rule, I think that all collectibles should be available for us to buy, to learn from, whether it's positively or negatively, because there's literally history in collectibles. It tells a lot about society, culture, thoughts, opinions. The physical formats are so important in the digital age, and the fact that it's becoming harder to sell certain collectibles, I feel like it's really important to do a video on this today, because it's obviously part of the business I run, and yeah, do that. But there's a quote that sticks with me, that I went to, like, outfits. I've been 2 times now, but when you go to outfits, I'm presuming it's still there. On one of the walls, there's a quote by a famous, like, Spanish philosopher, artist, I'm not sure, but he basically says, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And I feel like that quote is so fitting for this video, because the reason for collectibles being pulled from selling sites is, like, so subjective, and it's quite, like, dangerous, scary, concerning, I don't know, to see collectibles get pulled when I think it's like a person or a group of people imposing their values on what should or shouldn't be allowed on selling platforms. And granted, today I'm not going to, like, badmouth or talk about any selling platforms, because end of the day, like, when I get those messages saying these collectibles are not allowed, I have to adhere to those rules. But what I would like to do is share my opinion and basically put emphasis on the importance of collectibles and how subjective it is when certain collectibles get pulled, because there's reason for anything you sell, there's always an argument on why it shouldn't be allowed. Like, even this coffee mug that I'm drinking from, I'm 100% certain there'll be somebody out there that can justify why this should be banned and shouldn't be allowed, whether it's because of the people who were forced, maybe someone were forced to make it, it isn't, like, fair trade, climate issues, whatever. Like, there's always going to be an argument. But yeah, the aim today is to talk about some collectibles that I've had pulled from the selling platforms I've used, and just talk about why I think they should be allowed and the importance of them. So the collectibles that I've had pulled in question, I have had to, like, be careful what magazines I've pulled out, because some of them do, like, have nudity on the front and stuff. So all the ones I'm picking today don't contain any of that, and all the collectibles that I've ever had on other selling sites, I've always been careful to make sure that the collectibles are safe to sell, like, picture wise. So the company we're talking about, let me get in the best one. So it's relating to the company Playboy, and it's an iconic logo, and I'm pretty sure that most people in the Western world will still to this day recognise the famous Playboy bunny. But quite often I'm seeing that the collectibles are being pulled from online selling sites, the magazines. I've also got, like, sealed DVDs. Again, they're very collectible, and I'm in a position where I've sold, like, I'm not even sure like how much I've made on them, but I've still got thousands, and I don't even know how much I've got in terms of like Playboy collectibles, but they're very collectible. The sealed DVDs, and if you ever get say like the magazines that are sealed, um, they're just like extremely rare. Like they just don't really exist. But it's becoming harder for them to exist because, like I said, the value of them in some ways is going up because they're getting harder to acquire, but then they're also going down because these big marketplaces aren't allowing them to be sold. And before I go into why I think they should be allowed, it's a good opportunity to talk about Playboy and like why I think it's such an important company that the collectibles that still exist, we have to keep them and we have to talk about them to learn from them because I've wrote some like notes down based on the research I've done. Um, but you can't deny Playboy of its history, like the it Playboy influence from the mid 1950s up until like the mid 2000 like early 2000s. They massively influenced society regarding like attitudes around sexuality, freedom of expression, gender, pays, what else, culture, like linking. They've massively linked different what would you call it, topics. Like they spoke about like science and brought that into like the mainstream media, and controversial topics. They brought that into mainstream media. They did so many things, and that in itself is a reason for learning about Playboy because, say, for me, like running a business, it's so interesting, and I'm always fascinated to try and understand like how these businesses become so big because it's obviously not easy, and the Playboy bunny is like just it's a global icon now, and still to this day, people recognise the bunny without Playboy even doing half the work they used to do. They still have the website, and that's obviously maintained in a different way. But the work that used to go in all those years ago is like it's fascinating for me when it comes to business. But yeah, so say like in the magazines, you read it, opinions on like controversial topics of the time regarding sports, religion, sex, politics. For me, the more I learn about Playboy, it feels that the people behind the magazine were just not scared to talk about any issue that they wanted to address. And in today's like world, it feels like again it's something for us to learn from when we're seeing like collectibles get pulled for no real like justification. We see people get cancelled on like TV programs, whatever, for a mistake that maybe something they've said years ago or whatever. And so yeah, I feel like it's a really good company for us to learn from. Good being that it's got a lot of history. Don't necessarily agree with everything they've done, but yeah, let's have a little look. At the minute, I'm also reading this book, and this is a book by a guy called Russell Miller. It's the first edition, and it's actually signed by the author, and it's addressed to a guy called Andy Wheeler. And based on my research, that's actually the manager of Playboy London in the late 1970s. But this book is actually a really interesting book because you can see on the logo, like the bunny's got a tear and a sad face. So it's looking at the company Playboy from not necessarily a negative outlook, but Russell Miller didn't have like any reason to like talk positively about Playboy. He was impartial. So it's a really good way of reading and learning about the history of Playboy. And like I said, if collectibles like this don't exist, you only have one side of the truth. Whereas doing my own research, I'm learning my own things, and like something I found really interesting so far from reading this book is that the 1955 issue featuring Marilyn Monroe, the first ever issue of Playboy, Hugh Hefner didn't put a date on the cover just in case he didn't sell any just in case he didn't sell any magazines early on, and that way, if new customers were walking past, they'd always think that the first issue was a new magazine, and then they'd pick it up and buy it. Whereas if it had a date and month on it, and a year's gone by, people might pick it up and put it back on the shelf because it's old news. But by not having the date and month on, it was a way of Hugh Hefner basically thinking about how he can like make sure that Playboy doesn't die in its first month. And the first magazine did amazing. It was like perfect timing for Playboy magazine. But something I found really interesting, like when reading this book, is it talks about the origin of like how they came up with the name and how they came up with the bunny. And even though this is, say, Russell Miller, his research is only based on people within the Playboy business. But I then started to read a book by a guy called, it's a journal by a guy called Andre Didianis, who's like a famous photographer, followed Marilyn Monroe around. But what's interesting when I read this book is that in 1945, in his journal, he actually shows photos of like women, because that's like who he enjoyed capturing like photos of, with a Playboy bunny. And he had an idea of creating a magazine that basically had women portraying bunnies. And it's so interesting that, say, when I'm reading this and the version of events by like Hugh Hefner and the people around Hugh Hefner, how they came up with the name, it doesn't match with this photographer who I'm learning about, because he basically says in his journal that Hugh Hefner works for a publishing company run by a guy called Von Rosen, and Didianis quite often used to send photographs of women to the publishing company that Hugh Hefner works for. And let's see, Didianis's name is on the cover, is on the second issue of a magazine called Playboy, which is January 1954, and that's 1 year before Playboy made its name, and Hugh Hefner ever even came up with the name Playboy. So it's really interesting, like reading through like these physical books, because you do your own research and you come up to like your own conclusions. But without these physical pieces existing, we can't. You can't learn. And in like a digital age where everything can be changed online, it's just concerning that like the history can be altered. Because, and yeah, I really hope this video does justice. But when it's so important, I can't stress how important it is for like collectibles to be available for collectors. And I want to give some examples today on like companies where you could argue that their collectibles could be pulled, because in like under subjective rules, like if somebody imposes their values, there's a reason that any company can be taken off the collector's market. Let me show you here. So again, I've done my own research here, based on like what I know. But I would say, like, if anything I say, like, do your own research, and that goes for like anything you do, wherever, whatever. But I want to talk about, say, like Nike as an example, because when you learn about like global businesses like this, I feel like they all have one thing in common, and that one thing is that they all have histories that lean on like bad practice, bad ethics, bad morals at some point or another. And Nike, I want to give them as an example. So like in the 1990s, based on my research, I've seen that Nike moved a lot of their operations from the United States over to like Asian markets like China, and they actually outsourced their operations. So even though they may have known it was happening, they could not be linked to, say, like what was happening over in Asia in the 90s in the factories at China, such as like child labour, poor wages, poor working conditions, like unsafe working conditions. But they did that in the name of profit. And my question is, if say like these magazines are being pulled off for the history of Playboy, what's stopping all of a sudden if I try to list a Nike t-shirt from the 1990s, what is stopping that being pulled? Because you get a notification saying, sorry, this t-shirt was produced under, I don't know, unsafe working conditions or child slave labour, because there is argument for those. So like what is stopping that, and how does a company decide that this is, say, like immorally wrong, but a Nike t-shirt that was produced under child slave labour, like how is that not wrong? And it just comes down to subjective, and yeah, find it interesting. And then another example here is Hugo Boss. So Hugo Boss is, as we know it, is like a high-end fashion retailer. It makes amazing suits, shirts, everything. But Hugo Boss, actually, when it started, again, this is based on my own research, but it joined the Nazi Party in 1931. And in the 1950s, it made its name, like colossal growth, from creating uniforms and workwear that basically supplied so many parties relating to the Nazi Party. And it wasn't actually until the 1970s that Hugo Boss became the company that we know of it today. And again, like my question is, what is stopping all of a sudden? Let's say I've got a Hugo Boss brand new suit that's been made this year. What is stopping that all of a sudden being pulled from selling platforms because of their previous links with, like, say, Nazi Germany? It really makes me wonder. And like I said today, I'm not here to badmouth like platforms, and them above examples, like I 100% think they should be allowed on selling platforms, because it's the only way we can learn from collectibles, and it teaches us about the history of companies, business, society, culture. And yeah, I want the emphasis today I want the emphasis today to try and be on the collectibles. And this video, I've tried to make notes and stuff, but it is hard because I'm not used to doing videos like this. But the emphasis has to be on how important collectibles are, whether people see them as good or bad. They're so important to be available because it allows us to learn about history and do our own research. And yeah, like, say again, I've mentioned like outfits at the start, but when you go into outfits, the outfits is so important to exist for as long as like humanity exists, because it reminds us what like human beings are capable of, and how much, yeah, I can't justify it enough. Like, there's one room when you walk into Auschwitz, there's a room that's filled with almost like windows, and in each of the window, like in the glass frames almost, there's glasses from the people who came to Auschwitz, and the room is like just filled with glasses, and each of the pair of glasses represents one person that came into Auschwitz. And I can't, like, when you walk into rooms like that, or even if you go to places like Auschwitz, like 90% of what you learn when you're there is like negative. You're learning about like deaths, you're learning about like tortures, like what even what like even what like soldiers had to do to like people in the camps and stuff. Like, it's horrible, but it's so important that places like that exist, because we have to learn from them. And it's the exact same with, like I said, the like companies like Playboy or Hugo Boss or Nike or whatever. These global businesses will always have negative connotations attached to them, but while I'm not saying that new collectibles should be made for them, but what I am saying is that like the collectibles that do exist should always be available for people to buy. And like I said, George Santayana sums it up perfectly when he says, what does he say? Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And yeah, it's concerning when collectibles get pulled off, because it makes me think that we're going backwards, not forwards, and we're not learning from like past lessons. But I'd love to know like in the comments what you think. Like, are the collectibles that you've tried to buy or sell that have been pulled from selling platforms? Do you think there's certain collectibles that should be pulled or not allowed on the internet? Yeah, let me know. And I hope this video made sense. Yeah, thanks for watching.